Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
I'm now joined by a resident economist, Marc Coleman. Marc, it's been a busy week with the publication of much economic data. What can you tell us about it?
It's been a busy one. It's unfortunately not been a positive one. And I recall our chat in July about unemployment. We were reporting a June figure, I think, in the region of 4.6%. And it had come from 4.2% in November of the preceding year. Well, it's now up to 4.9%. So it's up more than 0.5% in a year, which is not good. And I think that speaks of what we were saying about the white paper on enterprise, which, was launched in July 2022 before the ECB began to raise rates. And what we see now was that at the time that white paper was concluded, the whole economy was doing well and recovering from pandemic. But now with interest rates up over 4% since then, it's the domestic economy that's bearing the brunt of that. At least in Ireland, inflation is already down to 2.3%, which is close to the Eurozone reference rate. And, the higher index of consumer prices, which is the measure of inflation used by the European Central Bank. In Ireland, it's now negative month on month, so prices were down 1.1% in November. So that suggests that, at least for Ireland's case, the ECB has been way too aggressive. And as I said, the last interview we had, any further talk of an ECB interest rate is just absolutely overkill. And not only that, but the ECB may have been excessively brutal in driving down inflation too far, too fast. And if that number goes further down, Karl, if inflation in the Eurozone goes down to 1%, 1.5%, serious questions have to be asked, because what that means is the ECB will have inflicted tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of unnecessary job losses across the continent, and it has overshot its inflation target. And I think there's going to be serious questions to be asked in the European Parliament, because the ECB has not been listening to constructive criticism, but that's for another day. Can I also say that we are looking at GDP, which is in recession. Gross domestic product is now falling, and it's falling quite significantly, minus 3.8% in the third quarter of this year compared to the preceding quarter. And the modified domestic demand, which represents the domestic economy, suggests that there has been no growth in that quarter. So again, I called this in January. I had a client briefing referring to Game of Thrones, and it had an image on the front of a sword stuck in snow, and it said winter is coming. And the message was back then, nearly a year ago, that the ECB interest rates were going to bring the economy into recession. And unfortunately, sadly to report, that's happening. Also interesting weekly earnings numbers out. I particularly find it interesting that in the public sector, earnings are up 6.3% year on year in the third quarter. That's very interesting, because Pascal Donoghue is negotiating with the public sector unions at the moment. Compare that 6.3% with the inflation numbers I called out, 2.3% inflation year on year. So public sector pay is already growing at 3 times the rate of inflation. So I suppose big questions from the private sector taxpayer point of view, Pascal Donoghue, is should Pascal Donoghue be including private sector taxpayers in the negotiations, given that they're already earning significantly less than the average public sector worker, and their earnings are increasing by less. And as we know, we're now in a recessionary environment where people in the private sector lose their jobs. So I think big questions and a lot of focus for Pascal Donoghue before he takes that job in the IMF, if indeed he does.
Marc, I also want to get your view on the corporation tax receipts for November. They bounced back strongly after 3 months of decline. Minister Michael McGrath still cautioned that while corporation tax is now 4% ahead of last year, it's clear that the era of persistent overperformance is coming to an end.
Yeah, I think Michael McGrath is absolutely right, and he's an accountant, and we need more accountants in politics, and we need more accountants running the country, because I'm an economist, and I actually think this is an accounting phenomenon. I think it results from basically we have a very small number of companies accounting for a very large share of corporation tax. So, decisions that they make about accounting policy can flip or move a couple of billion euro worth of corporation tax receipts from 1 month to the next. So I really would not be paying a score by a big jump or a big fall in any 1 month. Now, these are cumulative numbers, so they are, I suppose, helpful.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was our resident economist, Marc Coleman, and Marc will be joining us again on next Saturday's programme.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.